The murder of Emperor Alexander Severus and his family by legionaries in 235 was a real shock to the empire. It was probably also a shock to the soldiers themselves, who quickly realized the depth of their transgression. Whoever became the new emperor would surely punish the legionnaires severely, so that the rest of them would not even think of repeating the performance. Therefore, for the safety of their own lives, the legionnaires urgently needed to nominate their own emperor, and such a man was found, Maximinus of Thrace. It is not known whether he incited the soldiers to rebellion or managed in time to take advantage of the window of opportunity, but the soldiers proclaimed him emperor, and he agreed. In general, on the personality of Maximin is worth to dwell a little more, in order to understand with whom the empire faced. It is not difficult to notice that in history he entered with a nickname, Thracian, denoting his homeland, the Roman province of Thrace. And it is very important, as by Roman standards, Thrace was on the edge of the world, inhabited though their own, but barbarians. Maximin's parents were, in all probability, a Goth and an Elancan. Maximin himself joined the army solely due to the military reforms of Septimius Severus, which launched the integration of the non-Roman population of the state into the structures of the army. The imperial army was one of the most accessible and stable social elevators of the empire, where the principles of meritocracy prevailed over descent. Therefore, a barbarian soldier gifted with military talents quickly rose to command positions. Perhaps, if history had turned out differently, Maximin would have been granted a senatorial rank for his service by Alexander Severus. But history has ordered it this way, and Maximin became emperor himself. Since the murder of Alexander Severus was completely unexpected, none of the factions within the empire, capable of speaking with their claims to the throne, simply did not have time to react. When Maximin's envoys arrived in Rome with the news of his proclamation as emperor, because of the shock, no one dared to do anything against it. The Senate confirmed Maximin and dutifully cursed the previous emperor. Since the whole career of Maximin was connected with the army, and the new emperor had no connections with politicians or administrators, he had to leave the old team of managers. And in general, according to the first, nothing in the empire did not change much. At the same time, Maximin himself did not hurry to Rome to take the reins of power, as he realized that on the civilians sitting there, now little depends. The first decisions of Maximinus were the announcement of the doubling of the salaries of all legionaries and the start of the campaign against the Germans. Both decisions were meant to bind the army to the emperor and show that he was their man. Where to get the money for all this? Maximin cared little, and only after the successful completion of the war with the Germans and the distribution of bonuses to the soldiers, Maximin would go to Rome. Being a military man to the bone, Maximin perceived the empire quite differently than its other rulers. For him, the main thing were the legions of Rome and the rest of the empire rear, which had to supply these legions uninterruptedly. So Maximin, faced with the fact that his decision to raise soldiers' salaries was draining the treasury, began to tighten the screws on taxation. Taxes throughout the empire were drastically increased, especially in the cities. Because Maximin's decisions only exacerbated the economic crisis and no more money was coming in, the military man on the throne came to the most sensible conclusion: he had to increase the pressure. Therefore, Maximin began to take away land holdings from urban communities, to repress senators and other large and not so large landowners, with the seizure of their property to the treasury. Naturally, this state of affairs could not but irritate the broad layers of civilians. But even in the army, Maximin's support was not absolute, and there were many supporters of the murdered Alexander Severus. The exposure of conspiracies in the legions forced Maximin to spend even more money to buy the loyalty of the army, which absolutely infuriated the inhabitants of the empire. The barbarian murdered the rightful ruler. The fact that soldiers did it was completely irrelevant in the masses' perception. Choked with taxes, trampled cities, looted temples. It's not very clear here, but Maximin was probably seizing property from the temple's possession. What's more, with great wit, He canceled all state spending on bread and entertainment, directing it to funding the army. The fact that Maximin did all this for a formally good purpose, the defense of the empire from the barbarians, few people cared. While the emperor was preparing for a campaign against the barbarians living beyond the Danube, the rear was booming, and the only question was where the first explosion would take place. The first could not withstand the inhabitants of the province of proconsular Africa, rebelled in the spring of 238, and proclaimed the emperor viceroy of the province, Mark Antony Gordian Sempronian. Don't look at his long name. Gordianus's family was small provincial, and stood rather low in the Roman aristocratic table of ranks. But by the 3rd century it didn't matter so much anymore. Gordianus was 80 years old, so he made his son, who was a legate under him, his co-emperor. The message about this was sent to the Senate, where both Gordian was immediately recognized as legitimate emperors, Maximin was declared an enemy of the people, and popular unrest swept through the city, during which many supporters of the Thracian were killed. As a proof of loyalty to the new dynasty, the Senate even proclaimed that the minor grandson of Gordian was appointed praetor. The new emperors were recognized by a large part of the viceroys, and unusually, by the population of the provinces of the East. The situation was absolutely insane. In the hands of Maximinus were the most capable military units of the empire. His men controlled most of the military contingents, and yet the inhabitants of the empire rebelled. The Gordians hastily tried to raise a militia to withstand the onslaught of the Numidian legate Capellanus, who, along with a legion, came forward to quell the rebellion. Quite quickly, he managed to defeat the militia of Gordian, the younger of whom was killed in battle, and the elder, unable to bear the news of his son's death, hanged himself. It would seem that the rebellion is suppressed, but in Italy, events developed completely unforeseen scenario. The lot was cast at the time of recognition Gordian legitimate, and neither the Senate nor the townspeople to retreat was nowhere to go. As in case of loss, they were waiting for a massacre. The Senate, having recovered from the shock and realizing that it was now the only body of power opposing the barbarian usurper, urgently began to search for someone to whom it was possible to quickly give power, because the legitimacy of the Senate itself among the soldiers was not that high. Within the Senate there were many warring factions which immediately entered the fight. Since at stake was the life of all participants in this action, in the end had to go to a straw decision, to elect 2 princeps, Pupien and Balbinus. At first glance it might seem like a return to the old republican times, as there were 2 consuls then too. But the nuances, as always, lie in the details. The powers of the newly elected emperors were identical to those of the previous holders of the office. Yes, 2 equal princeps would have to compete for the favor of the Senate, thus increasing its role in society, but there was no question of a return to the Republic. The position of the Senate in such a system was too precarious, because except as a tool to ensure the superiority of one princeps over another in making legislative decisions, no other methods of influence on the state machine he had. It is unlikely that, having dealt with Maximinus, Pupienus and Balbinus would not have come to the final battle to find out who was the master of the house. But even in this rather peculiar scheme interfered with the Roman plebs, which arranged another riot with a demand to recognize the grandson of the dead Gordian, also Gordian, who went down in history at number 3, Caesar, with the prospect of becoming Augustus, that is, the emperor. The Senate was forced to give in to this pressure, thus creating a rather stupid situation of having 3, and with the Senate, 4, centers of power in the state at once. Why did the people turn out to be such a principled supporter of the Gordians who had no time to do anything? Probably 2 motives were mixed here. The first is the agitation of the Gordian supporters, who were in Rome and were already counting on new appointments when they learned that the rebellion was over. The second is that their agitation fell on quite fertile ground. The Roman plebs have never been positively disposed to the Senate, believing that the fat cat's sitting there, trying all the time to rob them, and therefore saw in a strong emperor the protector of their interests, providing bread and spectacles. Despite the strange position of Pupien and Balban, They were immediately forced to take up the reflection of the campaign of Maximin on Rome. The fact that all of Italy refused to recognize Maximin as the legitimate emperor left hope for success. The cities in the former emperor's path refused to surrender to him. Instead of blitzkrieg and capture of the capital, Maximin was forced to engage in a long siege of Aquileia. During this time, on the side of the Senate went to the Roman fleet and part of the viceroys, and some with their legions. In these conditions, among the soldiers of Maximina began fermentation, and Parthian legion, recruited mainly from natives of Italy, revolted and killed Maximina, no longer wishing to participate in the war. After the warlord's death, most of his army chose to surrender. Pupien and Balbin, without making any effort, became the saviors of Rome and almost immediately began to prepare for confrontation with each other, gathering around themselves military contingents. The Senate could do nothing, being an indifferent observer of the unfolding drama. But its weighty word set another force, Praetorians, who considered the strengthening of the Senate and the presence of two equal heads of state absolutely harmful to them. In July 238, they revolted, killed Pupiena and Balbin, and proclaimed Gordian third emperor. The pseudo-republic did not live only one day before the 100 Days Get. The Principate returned, but the political and economic crisis did not think to stop, spinning more and more. The short reign of Gordian that followed will be remembered only for the fact that the emperor was a good man, but too young for the problems he shouldered.